The rain in Chicago was unrelenting that morning, a cold, grey sheet of water that seemed to wash away the vivid colours of the world, leaving only the stark contrast of black umbrellas and wet pavement. Eleanor stood by the graveside, the mud clinging to her heels, watching as the mahogany casket of her husband Julian was slowly lowered into the earth. She felt a profound hollowness in her chest, a physical void where her heart used to beat, surrounded by people who claimed to love him but had never truly known him. Julian's brother Richard stood a few feet away, his face a mask of practiced solemnity, checking his watch surreptitiously as the priest recited the final prayers. The air smelled of wet soil and expensive lilies, a cloying scent that made Elena feel nauseous, reminding her that the only person who had ever protected her in this city was now gone forever. As the small crowd began to disperse, moving toward the line of black limousines waiting like vultures on the tarmac, Elena felt a hand on her shoulder, but it wasn't a gesture of comfort. She turned to see Marcus Sterling, the family's longtime attorney, a man whose tailored suit cost more than the house Elena grew up in, and whose eyes held the cold, predatory gleam of a shark sensing blood in the water. He didn't offer condolences. Instead, he handed her a thick manila envelope, the paper damp from the rain, his grip firm, as if ensuring she couldn't refuse it. "We need to meet at the office tomorrow at 9, Elena," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of empathy, cutting through the sound of the rain. "There are matters regarding the estate that cannot wait, regardless of your grieving process." Elena looked at the envelope, then back at Sterling, realizing with a sinking feeling that the mourning period she so desperately needed would be denied to her. She glanced at Richard, who was already seated in the lead car, staring straight ahead, refusing to meet her eyes, a clear signal that the lines of battle had been drawn long before Julian's body had even gone cold. The drive back to the penthouse she had shared with Julian was silent and suffocating, the city blurring past the tinted windows like a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. Upon entering the apartment, the silence of the empty rooms hit her harder than the noise of the funeral. Every piece of furniture, every framed photograph screamed of his absence. She sat at the dining table, still in her black dress, and opened the envelope Sterling had forced upon her, her hands trembling slightly, not from cold, but from a rising sense of dread. The documents inside were dense, filled with legal jargon that twisted and turned like a maze designed to trap the uninitiated. But the core message was brutally clear. It was a notice of eviction and a freezing of assets, claiming that the prenuptial agreement she had signed years ago, one she barely remembered reading in the haze of wedding planning, left her with nothing in the event of Julian's death without a direct heir. The text implied that the apartment, the accounts, and even the car were property of the Vance family trust, controlled now by Richard. Panic began to set in, a cold sweat breaking out on her skin as she realized the depth of their preparation. They had been planning this while Julian was dying in the hospital. She remembered the nights she spent by his bedside, holding his hand while he slept, unaware that in the corporate offices downtown, lawyers were drafting the blueprint for her destruction. Julian had always told her not to worry about money, that he had taken care of everything, but looking at the papers in front of her, it seemed he had been wrong, or perhaps he had been outmaneuvered by his own blood. The betrayal stung more than the potential poverty. These were people she had shared Christmas dinners with, people who had smiled at her wedding, now stripping her of her dignity before the grass had even grown over Julian's grave. The phone rang, the sharp sound echoing in the high-ceilinged room, and when the answering machine picked up, it was Richard's voice, devoid of the warmth he used to feign. "Elena, I assume Marcus gave you the file," he said, his tone businesslike and rushed. "Don't make this difficult. We can arrange a small stipend for a few months to help you transition out, but the apartment needs to be vacated by the end of the week for the appraisers." The message ended with a click, leaving a silence that felt heavy and oppressive, the walls of the penthouse closing in on her like a cage. She walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline, the towering buildings piercing the low-hanging clouds, feeling smaller and more insignificant than she ever had in her life. She remembered Julian's laugh, deep and reassuring, and how he used to stand right here, looking at the same view, telling her that the world was shark-infested, but that they built their own island. Now the island was sinking, and the sharks were circling closer, their fins cutting through the water with terrifying speed. She felt a surge of anger mix with her grief, a hot, burning sensation in her stomach that told her she shouldn't just roll over and accept this fate. However, the reality was stark. She had no personal savings, having devoted her life to his charitable foundations, and her own legal knowledge was non-existent compared to a firm like Sterling and Associates. She went into Julian's study, a room that still smelled of his cologne and old paper, hoping to find something, anything, that could contradict the documents on the table. She rifled through the desk drawers, finding only old receipts, stationery, and a few sentimental trinkets that made tears well up in her eyes again. It felt like searching for a weapon in a house that had been disarmed. Every drawer empty of salvation, every file cabinet locked or purged of the vital information she needed. As night fell, the apartment grew dark, shadows stretching across the floor, mimicking the encroaching darkness of her future. She realized that she wasn't just fighting for money or a place to live. She was fighting for the memory of her marriage, for the truth of what Julian intended, which she knew in her soul was not this cruelty. The no-rights narrative that Sterling was pushing felt like a violation of Julian's love, a rewriting of their history together to suit the greed of the surviving family members. She barely slept that night, tossing and turning in the large, empty bed, the legal threats looping in her mind like a broken record. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, a pale and weak light that offered no warmth, matching Elena's mood as she prepared for the meeting. She dressed meticulously, choosing a dark navy suit that was conservative yet sharp, applying makeup to hide the dark circles under her eyes, arming herself with the only armor she had left, her appearance. She looked in the mirror and told herself to breathe, to not let them see her crumble, even though inside she felt like a structure whose foundations had been washed away. She grabbed the file Sterling had given her, clutching it to her chest, and walked out the door, leaving the sanctuary of her home for what felt like an execution. The elevator ride down to the lobby was nauseatingly smooth, the descent symbolizing her fall from grace in the eyes of Chicago's elite society. The doorman, who had always smiled and greeted her by name, avoided her gaze, a subtle sign that the rumors were already spreading, that her status had already been revoked. Stepping out onto the street, the wind hit her face, sharp and biting, but she lifted her chin, hailing a cab with a steady hand. She was going to the Lion's Den, to the polished mahogany conference room where her life would be dismantled piece by piece. But as the cab merged into the chaotic traffic, a fleeting memory sparked in her mind, a fragmented recollection of a conversation with Julian months ago, late at night, when the morphine made him lucid but cryptic. He had spoken of a safety deposit box, and a failsafe, words she had dismissed at the time as medication-induced rambling. Now, as the towering glass structure of Sterling's law firm loomed ahead, that memory solidified, becoming a lifeline in a sea of despair. She realized she might be walking into a trap, but somewhere, hidden in the city, there might be a key that could unlock a different ending. The conference room at Sterling and Associates was designed to intimidate, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and a table so long it required shouting to be heard from one end to the other. Elena sat at the far end, her hands folded in her lap, while Marcus Sterling and Richard Vance sat opposite her, flanked by two junior associates who were furiously taking notes. Sterling didn't waste time with pleasantries. He slid a new stack of documents across the polished wood, the paper making a harsh, scraping sound that grated on Elena's nerves. "This is the settlement agreement, Elena," Sterling said, his voice dripping with false patience. It grants you a singular payment of $50,000, provided you sign away all claims to the estate, the apartment, and the intellectual property of Julian's companies. Elena stared at the papers, the numbers blurring before her eyes. $50,000 was an insult, a pittance compared to the empire she had helped Julian build emotionally and socially. Julian would never have wanted this, she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength as she spoke. He told me I would be taken care of. He told me the trust was designed for both of us. Richard let out a short, derisive laugh, leaning back in his leather chair with an air of superiority that made Elena's blood boil. Julian was a romantic, Elena, but he was also a businessman, Richard sneered. The paperwork doesn't lie. You were a companion, not a partner. The prenup is ironclad. The pressure in the room was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders as the lawyers watched her, waiting for her to break, to cry, to sign the papers just to make the pain stop. Sterling leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table, his eyes locking onto hers with intense scrutiny. If you contest this, Elena, we will tie you up in litigation for years, he threatened calmly. We will freeze every penny you have. You will be homeless before a judge even hears your opening statement. This offer expires in 48 hours. The ultimatum hung in the air, a sword of Damocles suspended by a thread, forcing her to choose between immediate poverty or a prolonged, agonizing defeat. She left the meeting without signing, her legs feeling like lead as she walked past the glass-walled offices where people worked, oblivious to the destruction of her life. The 48-hour deadline was ticking in her head like a bomb, each second bringing her closer to total ruin. She needed to find what Julian had been talking about, that vague memory of a failsafe, but she had no key, no account number, nothing but a whispered conversation in the dark. She took a cab, not home, but to the bank Julian had used for his private affairs, a small, old-fashioned institution that valued discretion over flashiness. Standing in the lobby of the bank, she felt foolish, a desperate widow chasing a ghost, but she approached the bank manager, a man named Mr. Henderson, who had known Julian for 20 years. "I need to know if Julian left anything for me," she asked, her voice pleading. "A box, a letter, anything." Mr. Henderson looked at her with sympathy but shook his head slowly. "I'm afraid, Mrs. Vance, that without a key or authorization, I cannot disclose any information about existing or non-existing boxes," he said gently. "The protocols are very strict, especially now that the estate is in probate under Mr. Sterling's supervision." Defeated, Elena walked out of the bank, the wind biting through her coat, tears finally spilling over her cheeks as the hopelessness of her situation crashed down on her. She wandered the streets for hours, ignoring the calls from her friends, who were likely just looking for gossip, until she found herself in front of an old bookstore Julian used to love. She went inside, seeking comfort in the smell of old paper, and wandered to the section on history, his favorite subject. As she pulled out a copy of a book he had read to her on their honeymoon, a folded piece of paper fell from the pages. Not a magical note, but a bookmark she recognized. It was an old receipt from a storage facility on the outskirts of the city, a place they had used years ago when moving houses, a place she had completely forgotten about. The date on the receipt was recent, just 2 weeks before Julian had been hospitalized, and on the back, in his shaky handwriting, were the words, Unit 404. Code, our anniversary. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't a bank vault. It was a dusty storage locker, something so mundane that Sterling and Richard would never have thought to look for it. She realized Julian had hidden his failsafe off the grid, away from the corporate eyes that watched his every financial move. She hailed a taxi immediately, giving the driver the address of the storage facility, her hands clutching the receipt as if it were a winning lottery ticket. The ride took 40 minutes, leading her away from the skyscrapers and into the industrial greyness of the warehouse district. The facility was bleak, surrounded by a chain-link fence, the kind of place where secrets were kept and forgotten. She typed in the code, the date of their wedding, at the gate, and held her breath until the green light flashed and the gate rolled open with a metallic groan. Unit 404 was located in a long, dim corridor that smelled of dust and damp concrete. Elena's hands shook as she cut the cheap padlock with the bolt cutters she had borrowed from the facility manager, the metal snapping with a loud crack. She rolled up the door, the noise echoing in the empty hallway, and peered inside. The unit was almost empty, save for a single small fireproof safe sitting in the center of the concrete floor. There were no piles of gold or stacks of cash, just that solitary grey box, unassuming yet radiating importance. She knelt beside the safe, her knees scraping the cold floor, and tried the combination, again their anniversary. The dial clicked, the handle turned, and the heavy door swung open. Inside lay a single, thick envelope sealed with red wax and a letter addressed to her in Julian's strong, pre-sickness handwriting. She picked up the letter first, her vision blurring with tears as she read the first line. "My dearest Elena, if you are reading this, then my fears have come true, and the wolves are at the door." Julian's letter explained everything. He had suspected his brother and the board were maneuvering to push him out and, by extension, cut her off in the event of his death. He detailed how he had restructured his personal assets in a way that didn't show up on the company books immediately, creating a shadow contract that superseded all previous agreements. He warned her that using this would burn bridges permanently, that it would destroy his brother's reputation and expose the firm's corruption. "Open the sealed envelope only if they have left you no choice," the letter warned. "It is the nuclear option." Eleanor sat on the cold floor of the storage unit, the weight of the decision pressing on her. She wasn't a vengeful person. She had always sought peace and reconciliation. But thinking of Sterling's smug face, of Richard's cruel dismissal of her marriage, of the $50,000 thrown at her like scraps to a dog, something hardened inside her. They had declared war on her. They had stripped her of her home and her dignity. She wasn't starting the fire, she realized as she stood up, clutching the envelope to her chest. She was just bringing the gasoline they had forced her to carry. She left the facility with the envelope safely in her purse. Her demeanor changed. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. She didn't go back to the apartment to pack. She went to a cheap hotel, paying cash, and spent the night reading the documents in the sealed envelope, understanding the magnitude of what Julian had done. He hadn't just given her money. He had given her the power to reclaim the entire company. The next morning, the deadline would expire. She wouldn't call Sterling to beg. She would see him in court. The courtroom was a cavern of polished wood and hushed tones, the air thick with the tension of high-stakes litigation. Eleanor sat alone at the plaintiff's table, having fired the incompetent public defender assigned to her, choosing to represent herself, a move that had caused Sterling to smirk openly when he walked in. The gallery was filled with press and members of the Vance board, all whispering, expecting a quick slaughter. Sterling and his team occupied the defense table like an invading army, their stacks of files and laptops creating a fortress of legal intimidation. Judge Harrison, a stern man with a reputation for impatience, banged his gavel, bringing the room to silence. "We are here for the emergency hearing regarding the estate of Julian Vance," he announced, peering over his spectacles. "Mr. Sterling, you have filed a motion to dismiss Ms. Vance's claims and enforce the eviction." Sterling stood up, buttoning his jacket with practiced elegance. "Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff has no legal standing. The prenuptial agreement is clear, and the assets in question belong to the trust, not the widow. Her refusal to vacate the premises is a violation of the estate's rights." Sterling launched into his opening statement, a brutal character assassination that painted Elena as a gold-digging opportunist who had taken advantage of a dying man. He cited obscure clauses, twisted dates, and presented the $50,000 settlement as a generous act of charity from the grieving brother. Elena sat stone still, listening to the lies, feeling the eyes of the room boring into her back. She didn't flinch, didn't interrupt, didn't show the emotion they were desperate to see. She just waited, her hand resting on the leather satchel by her feet. When it was her turn to speak, the room was quiet, an awkward silence born of pity. She stood up slowly, not walking to the podium, but standing behind her table. "Your Honor," she began, her voice soft, but carrying to the back of the room without a microphone. "Mr. Sterling is correct about the documents he has presented. If those were the only agreements in existence, I would indeed have no rights." She saw Richard smile in the gallery, a smug, satisfied curl of the lip. "However," she continued, "those documents were signed under the assumption that the trust acted in good faith." Sterling interjected, "Objection, Your Honor, relevance?" The judge waved him down. "Overruled. Get to the point, Ms. Vance." Eleanor reached into her satchel and pulled out the thick envelope with the red wax seal, now broken. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the table was the only noise in the room. "My husband, Julian Vance, anticipated this precise moment. He drafted a notarized codicil and a separate ownership agreement 3 weeks before his death." She saw Sterling's eyes widen slightly. This document was not in discovery. "This contract," Elena said, lifting the document, "states that in the event of any hostile action taken by the Vance Trust against his spouse, specifically eviction or freezing of assets, the blind trust he established activates immediately." She walked toward the bench, handing the document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "It transfers 100% of Julian's controlling shares and personal assets directly to me, bypassing the trust entirely. It also revokes Richard Vance's power of attorney retroactively." The room erupted in whispers. Sterling turned pale, his composure cracking for the first time. He scrambled to his feet. "Your Honor, we have never seen this. It must be a forgery." The judge held up a hand, silencing him, his eyes scanning the document intensely. He flipped to the last page, checking the notary stamp, the signatures, the dates. The silence that followed was agonizing, stretching for what felt like hours. Elena looked at Richard. The smile was gone, replaced by a look of sheer terror. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said finally, his voice icy, "this document appears to be properly notarized and filed with the clerk of the court in, verify this, Cook County, under a sealed holding order." The judge looked at his clerk, who was typing furiously. "Yes, Your Honor. It was triggered for release upon Ms. Vance's request." The judge looked back at Sterling. "It seems your client's ironclad prenup had a poison pill, a very large one." Sterling was trembling now, his hands shaking as he reached for the water glass on his table. The arrogant lawyer who had treated her like a nuisance was now looking at a document that didn't just lose him the case, but likely cost his biggest client their company. I request a recess to review this," Sterling stammered, his voice cracking. "This is ambuscade by trial." Elena remained standing, her gaze fixed on him. "You set the deadline, Mr. Sterling," she said calmly. "You demanded the hearing today. I am simply answering." The judge leaned forward. "Request denied. The text is plain English. The trigger condition was the filing of Eviction Notice 204B, which you filed 3 days ago. By trying to throw her out, you handed her the keys to the kingdom." The realization hit the room like a shockwave. The reporters were typing frantically. Richard Vance looked like he was about to be sick. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the air felt charged with electricity. Elena looked at the gallery, meeting Richard's eyes. She didn't see a powerful CEO anymore. She saw a frightened man who had gambled everything on greed and lost. "Julian told me to trust the one who was silent," she said, addressing the court, but looking at Sterling. "You talked a lot about my lack of rights." But you forgot that Julian's right to protect his wife superseded your right to rob her. The judge closed the file. Based on the evidence presented, the motion to dismiss is denied. Furthermore, I am issuing a temporary restraining order against the Vance Trust regarding any assets named in this document. Ms. Vance is arguably the majority shareholder of the company as of this moment. The gavel came down with a thunderous crack, a sound that signaled the end of Elena's victimization. Sterling slumped into his chair, defeated, his face ashen. The legal titan had been brought down by a piece of paper he never bothered to look for. Elena gathered her things, her hands steady now. She hadn't just won a court case, she had shattered the glass ceiling they had built over her head. The break was complete, the truth was out. The immediate aftermath of the hearing was chaotic. As soon as the bailiff declared the court adjourned, reporters swarmed the aisle, shouting questions at Elena, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. But Elena didn't stop to give sound bites. She was flanked by court security, who escorted her out a side door, leaving Sterling and Richard to face the media storm. The image of the invincible lawyer trembling and the grieving brother looking terrified would be on the evening news, a public humiliation that Julian, in his kindness, had hoped to avoid, but which they had brought upon themselves. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, cleaner, sharper. Elena took a deep breath, realizing that for the first time since Julian died, the suffocating weight on her chest was gone. Her phone buzzed incessantly in her purse. Calls from board members, from Julian's old friends who had ignored her at the funeral, and even a desperate voicemail from Richard begging to talk and clear up this misunderstanding. She turned the phone off. There was no misunderstanding. The lines had been drawn, and they had crossed them. She went straight to the Vance Company headquarters. She didn't have an appointment, but she didn't need one anymore. Security guards who had been instructed to bar her entry just days ago now hurriedly opened the doors, their eyes wide with recognition and fear. News traveled fast. She took the executive elevator to the top floor, the same ride Richard took every day, but this time the silence was empowered, not oppressive. When the doors opened, the office was in a frenzy, shredders were running, people were shouting on phones. Walking into the main boardroom, she found the remaining board members huddled together. They stopped talking the moment she entered. These were men and women who had enabled Richard, who had looked the other way. "Mrs. Vance," the CFO stammered, standing up. "We were just discussing the transition." Elena placed her bag on the table. "There is no discussion," she said, her voice echoing in the large room. "The legal team is auditing every transaction made in the last 6 months. Anyone found complicit in the attempt to hide assets will be named in the civil suit." The panic in the room was palpable. This wasn't just about money, it was about careers, reputations, and potential jail time. Elena wasn't yelling. She was stating facts with the cold precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. She walked to the head of the table, Julian's seat, and sat down. It felt strange, too big for her, but necessary. "Richard is fired," she stated flatly, "and Mr. Sterling is barred from this building effective immediately. We will find new counsel." Later that evening, Eleanor returned to the penthouse. It was no longer a place of impending eviction. It was hers again. But the victory felt hollow in the quiet of the apartment. She poured a glass of wine and sat on the floor where she had packed boxes just 2 days ago. She looked at Julian's photo on the mantel. She had saved his legacy, yes, but the cost was high. She had seen the ugliness of human nature up close, the greed that could rot a family from the inside out. Sterling called her house phone, the only line she hadn't disconnected. She picked it up, expecting threats, but heard only a broken man. "Eleanor, Mrs. Vance, we can settle this," he rasped. "My firm, my reputation." She listened to him beg, the arrogance completely stripped away. "You didn't care about my reputation when you called me a gold digger in open court," she replied softly. "You didn't care about my survival when you gave me 48 hours to leave my home." You signed it all away, Marcus. You just didn't know it. She hung up, severing the last tie to his cruelty. The next few days were a blur of legal paperwork, but this time she was the one dictating the terms. She discovered the extent of Richard's mismanagement. He had been siphoning funds to cover gambling debts, using the trust as his personal piggy bank. Julian had known, but he couldn't prove it before he died, until Richard tried to execute the eviction, triggering the audit clause in the hidden contract. Julian had used himself as bait and Elena as the trap. It was a brilliant, desperate move by a dying man to clean house. Socially, the tide turned instantly. The same people who shunned her now sent elaborate flower arrangements and invitations to galas. Elena had the staff throw them all in the trash. She realized that her true circle was non-existent. She was alone at the top. The realization was isolating, but also liberating. She didn't need their validation anymore. She had the truth, and she had the power to reshape the foundation into something that actually helped people, rather than just serving as a tax haven for the rich. One night, looking through Julian's remaining files, she found a note attached to the original draft of the contract. It simply said, "Be brave. You are stronger than you think. Don't let them change who you are." It was the emotional release she needed. She cried not out of grief, but out of relief. The anger that had fueled her through the trial began to ebb away, leaving a calm determination. She wasn't just a widow fighting for scraps. She was the matriarch of a new era. However, the psychological toll was real. She found herself double-checking locks, mistrusting smiles, analyzing every document for hidden traps. The innocence she had before the funeral was gone, replaced by a cynicism that was necessary for survival in this world. She had won the war, but she had lost her softness. She looked in the mirror and saw a harder version of herself, a woman forged in fire. As the week ended, she stood on the balcony of the penthouse, watching the city lights. The lawyer was facing disbarment hearings. Richard was facing fraud charges. Justice had roared indeed, but in the silence that followed the roar, Elena found her true challenge, figuring out who she was now that the fight was over. She wasn't just Julian's wife or Richard's victim. She was Elena Vance, a woman who had walked through hell and came out holding the keys. 6 months had passed since the courtroom showdown, and the winter snow had melted into a tentative blooming spring. Eleanor sat in her new office, not Julian's old imposing suite, but a smaller, brighter room she had chosen for the Foundation's new headquarters. The Vance Corporation had been restructured, the toxic elements were purged, and the focus had shifted heavily towards the philanthropic work Julian had always dreamed of, but was too blocked by the board to fully pursue. Elena signed the final document of the day, a grant for legal aid to help widows facing unjust eviction, a cause that was now personally ironclad to her. Marcus Sterling had been disbarred. The news had been a small blip in the papers, a tragic fall of a legal giant, but to Elena it was the closing of a chapter. He had tried to reach out once more, through a mediator, asking for leniency in the civil suit she had filed for defamation. Elena had instructed her new lawyers to settle, but not out of kindness. She simply didn't want his name associated with hers anymore. She took his money, every cent the court awarded, and donated it to the very charities he had mocked during the trial. It was a poetic, if quiet, justice. Richard had avoided jail time by cutting a plea deal that left him bankrupt and exiled from the business community. He lived in a small apartment in the suburbs now, a far cry from the luxury he felt entitled to. Elena had seen him once, from a distance at a coffee shop. He looked older, defeated, stripped of the arrogance that had been his defining trait. She felt no joy in seeing him like that, only a dull acceptance that choices have consequences. She didn't approach him. There was nothing left to say. The silence between them was the final verdict. Elena's life had settled into a new rhythm. She was busy, respected, and feared in equal measure. The fragile widow narrative was dead, replaced by the reputation of a woman who had taken down a corrupt dynasty with a single envelope. But the loneliness was still there, a constant companion in the quiet moments. She visited Julian's grave every Sunday, not to weep anymore, but to talk to him, to update him on the company, to thank him for the weapon he had placed in her hands. On this particular Sunday, she brought a single white rose. The grass had grown over the mud. The grave looked peaceful, integrated into the earth. "I did it, Julian," she whispered to the headstone. "The house is clean. The legacy is safe." She felt a breeze rustle the trees, a gentle touch that felt like approval. She realized that while the hidden contract had saved her financial life, it was his belief in her strength that had saved her soul. He had known she could do it, even when she didn't know it herself. She walked back to her car, spotting a young woman sitting on a bench near the cemetery gates, crying, holding a stack of papers that looked suspiciously like legal notices. Elena paused. The old Elena might have walked past, too shy to intrude. The new Elena, forged in the fires of the courtroom, turned around. She walked over to the bench. "Is it a lawyer?" Elena asked softly. The girl looked up, surprised, tears streaming down her face. "He says I have to leave my house. My dad just died." Elena sat down beside her. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. Her direct line. "I know a very good legal team," Elena said, her voice steady and kind. "And I know exactly how to beat a bully who thinks you're weak." The girl took the card, looking at Elena with a glimmer of hope. "Who are you?" she asked. Elena smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes for the first time in months. "I'm someone who learned that silence doesn't mean surrender." Driving away, Elena felt a sense of purpose that transcended the company and the money. She realized that her experience wasn't just a trauma to be survived, but a tool to be used. She would become the advocate she never had. The hidden contract had given her power, but she was the one choosing how to wield it. She wasn't just guarding the past anymore, she was building a future. The city skyline appeared in the distance, no longer a fortress of sharks, but a landscape of possibilities. The fear that had once paralyzed her was replaced by a deep, abiding calm. She knew there would be other challenges, other Marcus Sterlings in the world, but she also knew she would never tremble again. She had walked through the fire and found that she was fireproof. That evening, she opened the balcony doors of the penthouse, letting the spring air fill the room. She poured 2 glasses of wine, placing one on the railing for Julian. She took a sip of hers, looking out at the vast, breathing city. "To us," she said to the night sky, "and to the truth." She stood there for a long time, a solitary figure against the lights, no longer waiting for a rescue, but standing guard over her own life. The roar of justice had faded into a quiet, unbreakable strength.